My name is Phyllis. I hope you know me. And together with me is Dr. Victor Prasad. And before I pass the floor and introduce Doctor, I think it would be best that we can have a short breakup of the session. So ice breaking. And what I'll basically do is ask few questions based on the topic, of course. And does anyone know what the topic of today's discussion is? Oh, I was looking at them. Acknowledging those who are online too. Okay, question number 1. Does anyone know what are the ages of the term we call children? When we say the word children, what are the age groups that we talk about? Any volunteers?
Right?
Yes.
Yeah. From my study foundation, it should be from the newborn to 12 years old.
Yes, that is right. Children are those in that category. Prize will be given later. Mr. Anthony will handle that. Okay, one more question and then I'll start the introduction. Does anyone know how many countries are there in ASEAN? Yes. 10 plus 1. Is that the correct answer?
Yes, correct.
Correct. Wonderful. Round of applause. Okay, ladies and gentlemen, we are here today to discuss and also hear from an expert series on SDGs and ASEAN, status of children and young people. I hope those online can hear me, and we want to acknowledge those who are joining us online and would like to encourage also that if you're online with us, we would love to see who you are and join us by opening your cameras. Okay. The topic again is SDGs and ASEAN, status of children and young people. We have today with us expert in the series, which is Dr. Victor Prasad Karunan. Dr. Victor has worked over 16 years with UNICEF as a regional advisor on participation and partnership at UNICEF Regional Office in Bangkok. He's also the chief of Adolescent Development and Participation in UNICEF headquarters in New York. And as a representative, deputy representative, and senior social policy specialist at UNICEF Malaysia. He was the regional development advisor for Save the Children UK and the regional office for Southeast Asia and the Pacific at Bangkok. Dr. Victor has been profoundly and working together with NGOs and civil societies and international development organizations, agencies, United Nations agencies, and governments, private sectors, and child rights, child development associations. So, of course, the whole background is building towards this advocacy for status of children and young people, which means that we do have a person who is actually expert in this topic and would like to share with us on these topics that we're going to learn today. So I would, without further ado, I would like to pass the floor to Dr. Victor for the speech.
Yeah.
Over to you.
Thank you. Oh, okay. Good. Good morning. It's good to be back in KL. I left Malaysia 2016 after 6 years of work with UNICEF. That was a great time when I knew Dr. Dennison. We did a lot of work together as well. So it's good to be back here in Kuala Lumpur in Malaysia. I'm participating in the World Conference on Statelessness, which is happening here in Taylor's University this week. We have about 400 participants from all over the world talking about undocumented and stateless peoples in Asia, globally. So that's a meeting I'm attending this week. As you saw from the brief introduction, in the last 20, 30 years, I've focused a lot of my work on children and young people, and particularly now much more focused also on the SDGs and what that means for children and young people. So what I'm going to take you through today is based on that experience of having worked with NGO civil society on human rights, then also being an academic. I teach development studies, social policy, and human rights in Bangkok, and also being with the United Nations for about 16 years. So I've seen the UN from a country context like in Malaysia, I've seen it from a regional context in Bangkok, and I've seen it also at the global level in New York for 6 years. Yeah. So what I'm presenting to you today is based on that experience. So that's where I'm coming from. What I'll take you through today is basically to see how we unpack the Sustainable Development Goals and what that means and what that implies for the rights and well-being of children and young people. Yeah. So to start with, we have to go to the basics. And that's, I was very pleased with your first question for the icebreaker. That's a very simple question, but it's also a very controversial question. Who is a child? Yeah. So let's address that first. When we say child, who do we mean? Boy, girl, or transgender? What is the age group? That's the legal definition of the child. Yeah. So the flow of the presentation will be as follows. I'll be looking primarily at ASEAN countries, the 10 in particular of ASEAN in relation to Sustainable Development Goals. So start with the basics, what I call the conceptual confusion about children, first of all. Yeah. Then we look at ASEAN and the SDGs. How has ASEAN performed in relation to the SDGs over these last, half the period that has passed already, since 2015. We'll then look at the Convention on the Rights of the Child, what we call the CRC, because that's the main legal instrument, as you know, that's been ratified by all countries except one globally, and that provides a legal framework for children. So all countries, including Malaysia, have ratified the CRC. We look at the reservations, and I'm focusing on reservations because that's where some of the main problems lie for children and young people. Not in the adoption of the convention so much, but more in the reservations that countries have put forward to the CRC. And I'll explain what reservations are as well. And same goes for the optional protocols of the CRC. I will then spend a little bit of time on the key principle. One of the 3 principles of the SDGs is no one left behind. Yeah. This is what I call the most important principle in my view, especially for ASEAN and Southeast Asia, but it's also the most controversial, the most sensitive of the principles of the SDGs, and I'll explain to you why. We'll then look at the latest report that was just released last week by ESCAP, the Economic Commission for Asia and Pacific, just issued last week in Bangkok, the 2024 report of the status of SDG progress in Asia Pacific. Yeah. And I will leave a copy of the publication also with Dr. Dennison. I've looked at that carefully over the last few days, and there are some alarming conclusions and findings from that report from the UN on Asia Pacific. And finally, I'll close with opportunities, challenges, so we have enough time to discuss and exchange ideas and views. I very much welcome your questions as well as your comments. So let's start with the conceptual confusion first. Who is a child? How do we define children? The Convention on the Rights of the Child, which was adopted in 1989, November, clearly states in Article 1 that a child means every human being below the age of 18, not 12, below 18, unless the law applicable to a child in a country, the attainment is different, lower or higher, whatever. Yeah. Unless national law contradicts it. But in terms of UN definition, it's under 18. From the time you are born, and that's another question as well. When does a child begin? Is it in the uterus? When does life begin? That's a philosophical question. I won't get into that. That's another seminar for you. But starting from the time the child is born up to the last day of your 17th birthday, 17th year, the day you become on your birthday 18 years old, you're no longer a child. That's a legal definition. Yeah. However, there are problems with this definition as well, because the UN has been very clear in defining different categories of people. And the one we are talking about today, children and young people. So if children are below 18 years of age, as the Convention Rights of the Child, adolescents, the age group of adolescents is 10 to 19. You know? And this is official definition from the UN. Youth are 15 to 24, as per the UN General Assembly resolution, and young people are 10 to 24. These are resolutions adopted by the UN, United Nations, to define legally the categories of children, adolescents, youth, and young people. And this has been adopted by all countries as legal definition. So if you look at international law, international instruments, and so on, you will find these are the legal definitions that we use. Yeah. We just take a moment pause. Yeah, is that okay? For people to come in and settle down. Welcome. That's it. Let's test this out. Don't get the front door. Okay, so that's the first thing to remember, is that the UN has clearly defined the age and the legal age of these categories: children, adolescents, youth, and young people. So although you have that as the international standard, each country has its own definition of the child. Yeah. And that's where the problem is. So if you look at, for Cambodia, a child is anyone up to the age of 14. Malaysia, 18. Yeah. Philippines, 18 as well. Singapore, 14. Thailand, 18. And Vietnam, 16 years of age. Yeah. And the reason for that are cultural, historical, traditional. Yeah. Because at what age can you get married? At what age you get a passport? At what age you can give consent to sex? At what age can you be criminally prosecuted in court? Varies from culture to culture. That's part of the problem. Yeah. So although 18 years and below is the official legal age of the child adopted by all countries in the UN, each country has its own definition. And you'll see that contradiction as well. If you take the laws and policies, which I did when I first came to Malaysia, and looked at the legal definition of the child in various laws and policies, each law and policy had a different age for defining a child. You know? And that's the problem and the challenge in all countries. Okay. Very difficult thing to deal with, but what the UN says is that although you may have your specific definitions for the child, given your cultural, historical context, and so on, we must aspire towards making it even to 18 as a legal age. So even countries like Saudi Arabia, 3 years ago, changed its law on marriage, to 18, equally for boys and girls. Even a so-called conservative country like Saudi Arabia has done that. Yeah. So it's interesting. Countries are reviewing that policy. Okay. Good. I'm going to do a short exercise now, which I normally do in my lectures in class with my students. A short exercise. Let's do an exercise. And you will see why we're doing this exercise. Okay. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to ask you to close your eyes for about 10, 15 seconds. And then I'm going to ask a question. Okay. So close your eyes for a few seconds. And think of a child. Imagine a child. Picture a child. It could be your son, your daughter. It could be your neighbor. It could be anybody. Think of a child. Imagine a child. Okay? Open your eyes. How many of you thought of a child who is a small baby or infant from 0 to 5 years? Put up your hands. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10. Okay, so about 10 of you imagined a child or thought of a child as soon as you heard the word child, 0 to 5. How many of you thought of a child who was between 5 and 10 years old? Put up your hands. 5 and 10. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9. Close. Okay, 10, 9. How many of you, when I use the word child, thought of a young person who's between 10 and 18? 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7. Good, not bad. 7, 8. Okay, 10, 9, 8. When I do it in Thailand, my class is much worse. Meaning, very few people think of adolescents or teenagers like you. Yeah, I don't know what your age is, but approximately, yeah, like you, as being children. They do come under the category of children. So children is actually broken down into various subcategories. Infant, yeah, young child, adolescent. And only then you become a youth. Yeah. So that's my second message. When you hear the word child or child rights, yeah, you must think of a human person, boy or girl, who could be an infant, but who could also be an adolescent or a teenager. Now, no adolescent or teenager, I'm sure you agree with me, would like to be called a child, isn't it? You don't like to be called a child by your parents or your teachers or everybody. Because you have an identity as a different age group, different maturity, and your overall physical, social, psychological development. And that is my focus of over 10 years of my work with UNICEF, is on this group of adolescents and young people, and I'll come back to that. Yeah? So that's my second message. We use the term child very loosely. We do not realize that within that there are different categories of people with different ages, different levels of maturity, different psychological, social. The first, the age. The second, what we call the level of maturity. Yeah. There's a concept in child rights studies which we call evolving capacities. Yeah, evolving capacity. You could Google that and look at some of the research that has been done. What does evolving capacities mean? That the child's capacities and abilities, psychologically, socially, culturally, and otherwise, awareness, knowledge, is depending on the age and the context. And it evolves as the child grows from 0 to 18. That's the concept of evolving capacities. So when I talk to a child who's 5-year-old, I use a different language. I use different ways of communicating. I tailor my questions to the level of maturity of a child who's 5. If I'm talking to an adolescent who's 17, 18 years old, everything changes. You don't talk to an adolescent like you do with a child, which is what our parents do most of the time. The biggest mistake that parents make is they talk to their teenagers like they are 5-year-olds and 4-year-olds and 3-year-olds. Yeah, we cannot do that anymore, because the rights of children clearly ensures we must take into account their age as well as their evolving capacities. So that age group of adolescents is what we call in UNICEF the second decade of life. Yeah, first decade 0 to 10, and the second decade when there's increasing agency, independence, maturity, and cognitive development, intellectual development, social awareness and development of the child happens between 10 and 20, and then beyond. Yeah. The convention, this is a very quick summary. I can't go into the convention rights of the child it's very much detailed, but just the best way to understand the convention, it consists of 4 categories of rights for children and young people. The first are basic survival rights. You have the right to life when you're born. You have the right to a name. You have the right to a nationality. You have the right to live with your parents, so on and so forth. Yeah? Basic rights to life, standard of health, nutrition, and standard of living, etc. Those are what are called survival rights, which all children should have, irrespective of your race, your religion, your culture, your context, etc. Yeah? The second are the rights to protection. There are articles in the convention that safeguard the children from abuse, exploitation, and violence. Because we know the problems of child labor. We know the problems of child marriage. We know the problems of trafficking, sexual abuse, etc., etc. So a whole series of rights that talk about protecting and safeguarding children from exploitation, abuse, and violence. Category 2. Category 3, very important, the right to participation. Children have a right to participate. They have a right to share their views, opinions, perspectives, and knowledge. And we as adults need to take that into account when we make decisions, when we develop policies, when we make rules and regulations in school, etc., etc. Children have a right to speak up. Children have a voice, and that they have a right to be heard. Yeah. That is the freedom of expression that is ingrained in the Convention of Rights of the Child. And finally, more generally, rights to development, particularly education, early childhood care, development. As you know, a lot of work is done on that here in Malaysia as well. The right to leisure, recreation, social activities, etc., etc. These 4 are the best ways to understand the Convention of Rights of the Child. 4 categories of rights. So like men, like women, like elders, like disabled, like refugees, like indigenous peoples, children have similar rights. Yeah. So if we take any other convention, like the Convention on the Rights of People with Disabilities, you'll find that has also rights related to survival, protection, participation, and development. Yeah. Okay, one more quiz. Okay, how many members are there in the United Nations? How many countries are in the United Nations? Make a guess. Anybody? Don't count. It'll take a long time. Don't count. How many member states are members of the United Nations today? Approximately. Huh? 300? No, less.
103.
103, low. 167, closer. 193, perfect. 193.
But she said 193.
Oh, you said
193.
You said 193. Sorry, I thought 163. Yeah, I heard it 103 as well. 193 members of United Nations. Yeah, very good. So you're making note of all those who are getting
Yes,
prizes.
yes.
Yes, please. Number 2. Okay, 193 member states are members of the United Nations today, 2024. Okay. This UN Convention on the Rights of the Child, which was adopted in 1989, was immediately signed up by 192 countries. Which is a country that has not until today signed the UN Convention on the Rights of the Child? Guess.
Yeah.
No?
US.
Yes. The United States of America is the only country today that has not signed the Convention on the Rights of the Child. And there's many reasons for that. Main reason being, if they have to adhere to a UN convention, when a signatory has to adhere, they have to incorporate the principles and the provisions of the international convention into the national law. US is unwilling to do that because they have to change their constitution. And you know how difficult that is in the US, number one. Number two, many US government's position is, and lawyers' positions are, that many of the legal provisions of the rights of the child in the convention contradict the rights of parents. And given the neoliberal approach and so on of individualism and self-interest and the right of the individual in the US, which is the core value of the Constitution, they believe that the conventions would violate the rights of parents and adults and elders, etc. So for various reasons, it's still a big debate as to why the US has not signed the Convention on the Rights of the Child. So the only way that NGOs and civil society in the United States fights on children's rights, or advocates or litigates, is using national law in the US. And each state is different, as you know. California, New York, and so on is much more progressive. The southern states are still very conservative. But in many cases, judges in California, New York, and so on, Chicago, have also invoked the convention, although they've not signed it. Yeah, but they do invoke the principle of the convention when they deal with litigation cases on child rights, child abuse, exploitation, etc., and so on. So, but that's an interesting fact. Yeah. So now, let's look at SDGs and ASEAN. What's the general situation today, as of now, in terms of the SDGs? So we have 10 countries of ASEAN. With Timor like +1, very soon could be a member of ASEAN now. In ASEAN, and this comes from the Sustainable Development Report 2023 last year, Thailand topped in reaching nearly, not all, but as many goals as possible within ASEAN. Thailand right now is at the top, has been ranked first for the 5 consecutive years, 2019 to 2023, followed by Vietnam, number 2, then Singapore, then Indonesia, then Malaysia, Philippines, Brunei, Cambodia, Laos, and Myanmar, in that order. Yeah, because the UN took stock of countries in terms of the performance on the SDGs, on all the goals and targets, yeah, and ranked them according to progress and so on. So as you see, there's a lot of work to be done in many countries. Malaysia is somewhere at the middle level at this point. And we're now 2024. 2030 is coming 6 years from now. Yeah, we're more or less more than halfway. But that's the ranking of the progress right now. Some countries are doing very well. And surprisingly, and in my view, surprisingly, the countries like Brunei and Singapore actually are not doing that well. Yeah, especially Brunei. With all the resources and being a small country and so on, has not performed as best. We understand Laos, Cambodia for reasons of LDC, etc. status, but Brunei is quite surprising as well. So if you look at just the few indicators, if you look at poverty, that's where perhaps we've had the most success in ASEAN. Most countries across the board, including Laos and Cambodia and so on, have been able to bring down the rates of poverty particularly in the rural areas. So that's good so far, yeah. Hunger and nutrition, also doing much better, much more universal health coverage, more people having access to health services, etc. Generally speaking, across the board, except in remote areas and in hill country, etc., where it's more difficult, but generally in terms of hunger and health, we have done quite well. Education has not been that good. Yeah. Because the goals and targets of the SDGs talk about lifelong learning, talk about inclusive education, education for all, yeah, universal primary education, and so on. So on education, most of our countries, including the more affluent countries in ASEAN, are not doing too well. The big challenges are, one, dropout rates. Same in Malaysia as well, as you know. Look at dropout rates between primary and secondary school, increasing over time, especially with girls dropping out from primary to secondary. Yeah. Second is access to education. People living in remote areas and so on, having difficulty in the access. Equity in education for the rich and the poor. And so in all these areas, there are big challenges for us in ASEAN. Yeah. In gender equality, there has been some progress, particularly in two areas. One, in number of women who are now getting into parliament, yeah, or in political life is increasing in ASEAN countries, although there's much more needs to be done. We're still not reached the parity that we need to get, but much more is done. Second, women in business has definitely increased, especially with small enterprises and startups, etc. You see more and more family business, more and more women getting into economic enterprises and business. Some sectors are good, but discrimination against women still continues. Stigma still continues to a large extent. Very subtle, yeah, and very difficult to deal with. But the stigma of women still very much is a challenge that we need to address. And finally, justice and inclusive societies, which is basically human rights, equality, yeah, equity issues, but also governance and accountability. There we're not doing very well. And you see the data as we progress. And this comes from the ASEAN Secretariat's report over the last recent years. So summary, good news, poverty has been halved. We've increased life expectancy. As you know, many of our countries are becoming more aged, older. Yeah. We have improved access to clean water, hygiene. Neonatal and infant survival has increased, universal provision of healthcare, and near universal access to primary education. On that, we've done very well in ASEAN. Countries like Thailand reaching 98%, I think. Most countries beyond 70%, 60, 70% of access to primary education, primary level. Yeah, we've done very well. But the not so good news is that many children are still being left behind. And particularly in our case in ASEAN, refugees, migrants, undocumented, and stateless children. That's a conference I'm attending here in Kuala Lumpur this week, and looking at the presentations and the figures that are coming out from not, especially in Asia Pacific, because we have the largest number of stateless peoples globally, not Latin America, Africa, Europe. Asia Pacific has the largest number of stateless peoples because of populations, yeah, and the mass migration, etc. So that is an issue to deal with. I'll come back to that later. Increase in violence, abuse, and exploitation of children. And now, as you know, more and more with online sexual exploitation. The biggest challenge we're facing today in this area of child exploitation is online, social networking. Yeah. And how companies, how perpetrators, pedophiles, and so on are using the latest technology to be able to reach out to young people, children, and so on, online for grooming, for sexual favors, for photographs, videos, etc. This is becoming a big challenge all over ASEAN, and there's a lot of attention being paid by governments. I should also mention a piece of research I'm doing with ASEAN now. We're also looking at AI, artificial intelligence, and how that is increasingly becoming used by perpetrators and pedophiles to sexually exploit children. The latest technology on AI is being used for that purpose as well. Yeah. So these are the red flags. These are the ones that we really have to be careful about as we move on. And not an easy problem to deal with. Teenage pregnancy is on the rise in many countries, including Malaysia. Teenage pregnancy, unwanted pregnancy, whatever you call it, and mental health. Mental health has always been a problem in ASEAN, but with COVID, that was further aggravated more and more, not just in terms of learning disabilities or challenges and so on that children face because of going online, but also social pressures, pressure from families on education, etc., etc. Adolescent mental health is another area that's completely neglected in our work in ASEAN. Yeah. So that's something that we really need to focus on. So these are the areas where we need to focus attention for our research, for our advocacy, and for our policy work in ASEAN. Yeah. Okay, I'll quickly go through reservations. You will have my PowerPoint with all the details. There's a lot of detail. Now, what are reservations? So when a country like Malaysia signs the Convention on the Rights of the Child, yeah, I think Malaysia did that in 1994 or 5. So when a country signs the Convention on the Rights of the Child, they have the right to make reservations, meaning they can say, we agree with Article 1 that all children should be below 18 years of age. We agree with that. But in terms of these specific provisions, like the age of marriage or age of consent and so on, our national law is much less. That's a reservation. It's called a reservation. Countries have the right to do that. So every time they ratify a convention, they can make these reservations. So if you go into the reservations and analyze what countries are reserving on, it gives you an idea, good insight into where the challenges are that we have to address. Yeah. So that's what I did. So the piece of research that I did was to look at what the reservations are of 10 ASEAN countries on the Convention on the Rights of the Child. Yeah. So there are 6 ASEAN countries that have entered or retain no reservations limiting their obligations to the CRC, meaning these countries have no reservations at all, which means they accept all the 54 articles of the Convention on the Rights of the Child. They are Cambodia, Indonesia, Laos, Myanmar, Philippines, and Vietnam. Other countries have signed the CRC, but they have reservations. Those are Brunei, Malaysia, Singapore, and Thailand. Okay. They've entered about 20 normative articles in Part 1 of the Convention as reservations that does not apply to their national law and their provisions. Okay. So if you look at what they are, I won't go through the list, but just to give a gist of what my research showed. Yeah. If you look at Brunei, they have reservations, or they do not accept that children have a right to participate. Article 12. Yeah. What they're saying is, when children have views and they express their opinions, we are under no obligation to listen to them. That's as straightforward as that. There's no Article 12 application in Brunei. Yeah. Or Article 20, which is a protection of a child without a family, orphans, abandoned children, etc. And as you know, in Brunei, the Sharia law also is important to consider, like Malaysia. You must look at these reservations also in the context of Sharia law, and that's where in most countries, particularly in Brunei, Malaysia, and Indonesia, the challenges are. Many of these reservations are drawn from Sharia law because they contradict what the penal code says or what international law says on children, family, etc. Yeah. So Brunei adoption is an issue. Yeah. Indonesia has recently withdrawn the reservations. Malaysia, non-discrimination reservation, meaning that all people are not equal. Yeah. Because of racism, ethnicity issues, as we know, which has been for a long time and still continues to be a big issue in the country. So Article 2, Malaysia does not accept. Article 7, name and nationality. Again, we're just talking about the new proposals to revise the nationality law in Malaysia. Yeah, big controversy around that. But name and nationality is also an exception. So the reservation on that. Freedom of thought, conscience, and religion as well. Malaysia has reservations, does not accept the CRC. And torture and deprivation of liberty. Yeah, so Malaysia has not ratified the Convention on Torture, as well as Article 37 of the Convention on Rights of the Child, for example. Yeah. Similarly, Myanmar, Philippines, no. Singapore, many reservations. And Thailand, the only one big sticking issue, not others, is Article 22 on refugee children. Because Thailand, as you know, has over 1 million plus migrant refugees, undocumented people from Myanmar, from Cambodia, Laos. It's like a big problem there. And their rights is a big challenge to deal with for the country. Yeah. So they have an exception on CRC on the rights of refugee children in particular, coming from Myanmar, Cambodia, Laos, etc., which is understandable, and they're still struggling with that. So what this reservation means is that the country has an exception, so they're not obliged. You can't sue them in a court of law in Malaysia on those articles. That's what I'm saying. Yeah. Torture meaning, that's where the Convention on Torture kicks in. Yeah, basically that anybody under detention, yeah, would not be subjected to the Convention on Torture, which means that anything can be done by the police or the prison authorities, etc. You can't invoke them or bring them to a court of law based on that. Yeah. Deprivation of liberty, meaning that Malaysia would have exception to that article in saying that liberty will be constrained, or not constrained, limited based on these national provisions of the law. Yeah. So on these particular issues, like you have certain articles in the Constitution, for example, which cannot be questioned. Yeah. And so on. There are taboo subjects that you cannot talk about in public. So those are areas that the government will impose or preventive detention, internal security, terrorism, and so on and so forth. On those counts, the state or the government has the right to impose its national security laws, which are not compatible with the UN Convention on Rights of the Child or international conventions. And in the case of Malaysia, it's the Internal Security Act in particular. Yeah, that's what it means. So those are reservations. Now, what happens is, because the governments report to the Committee on the Rights of the Child, they are questioned every time they go to Geneva on these reservations. So when Malaysia comes for its next report, Malaysia has already submitted, I think, 3 reports. When they come to Geneva, to the Committee on the Rights of the Child to submit the next report on the CRC, the committee will ask them, so what have you done about Article 2, Article 7, Article 14, Article 6? What's the progress? Meaning the dialogue happens in order to help the government give advice, support, technical assistance through UNICEF, through UN agencies, to help them to gradually lift the reservation. But as you know, it takes a long time. It can be done 1 year, 2 years. You can't solve these problems in 1 year, 2 years. So this is an ongoing dialogue that takes. So that's why focusing on the reservations is important, because that's where you see our work needs to be done on children and on child rights. Yeah. Moving. Now, the convention came up with 3 optional protocols. Now, briefly, an optional protocol is an additional guidance that's provided to governments on a very important or sensitive topic, or a topic that needs more clarity for governments to apply the Convention on the Rights of the Child. So for the CRC, there are 3 optional protocols that have been adopted. Yeah. So the first optional protocol is involvement of children in armed conflict. Jumping. Yeah. Involvement of children in armed conflict. So this optional protocol gives further guidance to governments how to deal with children who are involved in armed conflict, whether it's child soldiers or all types of youth gangs and so on and so forth. Yeah. So many countries in ASEAN have signed this: Brunei, Cambodia, Laos, Malaysia, Myanmar, Vietnam, Thailand, Indonesia, Singapore, Philippines. Not Malaysia as well. Yeah. So these countries have already signed up to this convention. Okay. So therefore, they have to adhere to the provisions of this convention in dealing with children who are involved in armed conflict and violence, etc. The second is on sale of children, child prostitution, and child pornography. Most countries in ASEAN, except Singapore, has signed this optional protocol as well, except Singapore, for their own reasons. Yeah. The third one is a new one, which came out only in few years ago. Only Thailand has signed the third protocol. Third protocol is what is called a communication procedure, meaning that children have a right to complain on violation of their rights directly to the CRC committee in Geneva. Yeah. With only one provision. They can do that. No, 2 provisions. First, only when the country has signed that optional protocol. So in this case, only Thai children can do that. Malaysian children cannot, because you're not signed the optional protocol. Second, only when the children have exhausted their national legal procedures. Yeah. So in the case of adoption, trafficking, or custody ownership of the child, in case of divorce, whatever, if the child is fighting the case in court, it first has to exhaust the Malaysian legal system. And if the child still feels it's not been given the right verdict on that violation, it can then approach Geneva. Yeah. This is a new optional protocol, and only Thailand has signed it. And what is very interesting, since this came into force, the third optional protocol, is that you have many children from Europe in particular, and Latin America and so on, who are going to the Committee on the Rights of the Child, filing complaints and cases on climate change. The first case has come up. You've heard of Greta Thunberg. Greta, the climate change activist from Sweden. Yeah. She mobilized a group of 15 children from various countries in Europe and so on. And they filed the first complaint, international complaint, global complaint on climate change to the Committee on the Rights of the Child. And a similar thing was followed by countries in Europe as well. Children from Europe, countries in Europe. Yeah. So in terms of ASEAN so far to date, no particular case has gone up to the Committee on the Rights of the Child, from Thailand at least, for now. Yeah. So these are 3 optional protocols that also apply when it comes to children and child rights. So the SDGs, there are 3 key principles of the SDGs that underline all the goals and targets of the SDGs. The first is what is called universality, meaning that the SDG goals and targets apply to all countries, irrespective of rich and poor, landlocked or island, whatever, north, south, whatever. No, universality applies to all countries. Now, universality does not mean uniformity. Yeah, there is a distinction. We're not saying all countries should apply or implement the SDGs in the same way. They can't. So, universality respects the country's local context, ability, resources, capacity, institutions to be able to implement the SDGs. But what it says is that as a standard, as a global standard of development, it applies to all countries equally. So from the United States to Fiji, yeah, the goals and standards, targets are the standards that both these countries need to apply and implement. How they do it would vary. The US would do it in one way, the Fiji might have a different way of doing it. That's the first. The second is what we call policy integration. The three pillars of development: economic, social, and environmental. Now, there are three pillars of development: economic, social, and environmental. These three need to be integrated in all the policies and programs of the government. So you can't just focus on the economic and neglect the social. You cannot just focus on the social and neglect the environmental. They need to have an integration in all the policies and so on when a country implements the SDG goals and targets. The third, like I said, which is the most controversial and most sensitive, is the principle of no one left behind. Yeah. What this means is that, and I'm putting this very simply, not legally. What this means is that the state or the government has an obligation to every human being in the country, yeah, in terms of protecting their rights and their well-being, not only citizens. You see the problem there? So, the government of Malaysia is accountable not only to the citizens of Malaysia who hold an IC card. You're accountable for me. I've come from Bangkok, right? I'm leaving next week, but I'm here on Malaysian soil. My rights have to be protected. As an Indian, I hold an Indian passport. Yeah? Government of Malaysia is obligated to protect my rights as an Indian citizen because I'm on your soil. But this also applies for refugees, migrants, and others. That's why I said this is very, very controversial. Government, by signing the SDGs, is obligated to take care of these people who are left behind. And most of them are non-citizens. Most of them have no documents. Most of them are also stateless, who live in the country. Many of them born in the country, as you know, for generations and still don't have any identity, therefore are not counted. They don't appear in statistics. If you're not counted, you are nobody, isn't it? If you're not counted, you are nobody. Because you don't appear in the data. If you don't apply in the data, you don't apply in policy, you don't have access to services, you have no right to claim anything. We are all here, lucky to be counted. We have an IC, we have a passport, we can travel, we can go access education, healthcare, whatever. But how many thousands and millions of people in our region are not counted? That's what the SDG says. Focus on those left behind. And what that means for us is that these people need attention, need policies. So when I reviewed 2019, the report submitted by governments to the UN on SDG progress. Now, these are called voluntary national reports. They are not compulsory. Yeah. So Malaysia is not compelled to submit a report to the UN on SDGs, voluntary. But at that time, when we did this, this was done by the policy group in New York. They surveyed 47 or 49 countries, reports to the UN on SDGs, and this is what they found. Most countries, nearly all of them, acknowledged the principle and said this is important, we need to address it. But very few were clear of how to do it. Yeah? How to implement the programs, how to defend the rights and protect the rights of these left behind, people left behind, etc. So in other words, they agreed to the principle, but they were not clear how to implement that because it was so complicated. In developed countries, no one left behind meant people from other countries, as you know, refugees from Somalia, Africa, etc., Mexico going into the US. For them, no one left behind were those populations that were coming from other countries. In developing countries like ours, or in the South, for us, the concept of no one left behind are primarily non-citizens. Yeah, that's a problem we have. Okay, so not only people coming across borders, which is also happens, as you know, but people who are within the borders who are also undocumented. So we have a bigger challenge in our region. Not just looking at Rohingyas coming from Bangladesh or Myanmar or whatever, yeah, but looking at people born in Sabah, yeah, for generations that has continued as a problem of undocumented and stateless peoples, etc. So these groups are primarily in Asia, minorities, indigenous peoples, racial, ethnic, religious groups that are not counted and that are not mentioned. That's what we mean by people left behind, and that's where we need to focus attention on. So out of the 47 countries, they found there's weak attention paid to the principle of no one left behind. Countries had rarely reported on this. Countries had rarely reported about integrating the SDGs and also looking at other goals and targets. SDGs related to environment, climate change, inequality, and governance received the lowest priority of attention in implementation, and as less as 0.2% of the budget. Yeah. And that's why I'm always surprised. There's so much talk about climate change. Everybody's talking about climate change. Look at the budget. Less than 0.2% being used to be able to deal with issues like climate change or governance, etc. Yeah. So it's not a priority. It's lip service that is being paid to some of these issues. Yeah. And few have calculated the cost of implementation. Very few countries have an SDG budget. I know Malaysia has one. Yeah, Malaysia is one of the first. Thailand has one. Vietnam has one. But not all countries have a budget even for SDGs implementation. Yeah. So how are we going to focus attention on these challenges? This report came out last week. And this is the most recent data. This is the one I mentioned, Dato. And I'll leave a copy with you. Yeah. And they surveyed the 47 countries. Sorry, it went back. How come the screen is not changing? This is changing. Okay, let's try this. No. Yeah, I need this one. It's not changing. Yeah, so this report came out last week, and what I did was just pulled out the main conclusions from the report. This survey was done in Asia Pacific. And it surveyed the status of progress on SDGs up to 2024. So this is the latest report that has come out. Yeah. So it says, based on current trends in Asian countries such as ASEAN member states, majority of them, it says, will fall short of reaching up to 90% of the targets in the next 7 years. So when you reach 2020, in ASEAN or Asia Pacific, 90% of the goals and targets will not be met. We are only meeting 10%. This is the latest report from the UN SCAP in Bangkok last week. That's where we are. Now, everybody agrees COVID is a big culprit. COVID-19. Nobody expected that to come. 2 years, 2.5 years. True. But even then, even if you take that factor out, what happened before COVID? right? Up to 2021, whatever, what progress had we seen from 2015 to 2020 or 21? We could have achieved so many goals and targets during that time. Of course, COVID was a drag. That's granted, yeah? And ASEAN's recent report examines only 29 SDGs out of 231 indicators, main problem being lack of data. This is a second issue. Majority of the countries, there's a lack of data on SDG goals and targets. If you don't have data, how are you going to measure? How do you know what's their progress? You know, this is a big challenge. How do we deal with the issue of data? And in ASEAN, Goal 5 received less attention than Goal 7. So, for example, gender received less attention than clean energy, which resulted in more underreporting across ASEAN. So countries have been selective in what they would pick up, what they would implement, etc. So these are challenges that we face in ASEAN today when it comes to SDGs. Half the indicators do not have sufficient data. So let's focus attention on that. How do we do more research? How do we get more data on many of the issues that we are dealing with and working on? Small island countries and LDCs, least developed countries, face the biggest challenge, of course. Girls and women, big challenges in education and employment. Climate action, climate change, critical, fundamental to address. And like I said, the no one left behind principle. Because we're still paying lip service to it, yeah, at governmental level and other levels, we are not really having any tangible results to deal with that problem of no one left behind. When it comes to children and young people, adolescent pregnancy, these are ones I would put on the top of the list to address. Adolescent pregnancy, mental health, substance abuse, and road safety. And look at this in the SCAP report. Thailand tops in all of these issues. Number one. See, on the one side, it said Thailand did the best in the SDGs, right, across ASEAN. At the same time, when you look at adolescent pregnancy, mental health, substance abuse, road safety, Thailand is number one top on ASEAN. Most adolescent pregnancies, most cases of road accidents. Thailand even beat Vietnam. Vietnam was number one, remember, 2 years ago. But now Thailand is top, road accidents, primarily involving boys and young people. Substance abuse, drugs, etc., and mental health. That for me was shocking. Also for children and young people in ASEAN, lack of participation in political and social issues, the question of free speech, still remains a big problem in ASEAN. And of course now, even more so, education and employability. The new skills that are required for young people to seek jobs in the new job market, and to what extent our universities and schools, etc., are providing that and enabling the young people to get this type of soft skills required for the globalized market that we have today to deal with. Okay, our universities are falling short, our schools are falling short. We are not changing. As a professor in the university, I know myself how difficult it is for me to change my curriculum in my university. You know that, those of you who are teaching as well. Yeah, how difficult it is to introduce new subjects. Yeah, and one of my colleagues in the university also told me, Victor, I can't even introduce a new topic in my course called climate change. In a social science course, to teach climate change, they don't see that as something that need to be taught in a social science course. It should be taught in the Department of Environment or Faculty of Environment somewhere. Yep. You know what I mean? That's a mindset. That's the boxes in which we work and so on. So those soft skills, those global challenges we face are not being imparted to our younger generation. And that's a big challenge. Battery is running low. Yes. Okay, I'll go through this quickly. So what we need to do, how can we address this? And for a group like this, I think the work you're doing on SDGs and so on is important. Yeah. Firstly, we need to build better understanding and the capacity of what I call influencers. The influencers are parliamentarians, and that's why I was so happy when Dato introduced me to your work. Parliamentarians are key. You know? It's not just the ministers who hold portfolios and make the final decisions and so on. Parliamentarians are key to bring up issues like this in Parliament, to be able to lobby with the constituencies, with civil society, with NGOs, academics, and others. Yeah? Parliament, national human rights institutions are key, NHRIs, because they are independent human rights, like SWACAM in Malaysia, yeah? SWACAM. So independent human rights institutions, civil society, NGOs, young people, youth organizations, those are the ones that we need to work with on the SDGs. Yeah? And we need to use the human rights mechanisms that are available to us within the UN to address some of the gaps and use the reporting systems. I don't think we're using that sufficiently. The reports that your government submits to the CRC committee, CEDAW, disability, and so on, all these conventions, there's a lot of data there. There are a lot of issues there that needs to be addressed. And we need to use that better for our advocacy purposes and so on. So we also, in those of us who teach human rights, we're also integrating that much more into our human rights courses. Yeah. So we just don't teach about Universal Declaration of Human Rights, civil political rights, economic, social. That is important, yes, but not enough. We also have to look at other mechanisms within the UN system which we can work with for addressing human rights and child rights. And that's why, to me, the link between human rights and SDGs is very, very important. You know, because in my view, human rights and sustainable development are interdependent and mutually reinforcing. You know, and that's how we can achieve sustainable development. Because 90% of the SDG targets are actually embedded in human rights treaties of other conventions, other declarations, and agreements made by the governments in the UN. Yeah? So how we use the SDGs to address the challenges like no one left behind, but also use that as a global operational plan to be able to overcome poverty, to be able to provide inclusive education, to provide open, transparent institutions, etc. You know, that's what's important. I'll skip that one. Okay, so to conclude, what are some opportunities that I see? The first and most important is we need to localize at the subnational and local levels the SDGs. We must bring it down to, I like that poster there very much, localization of SDGs in 222 parliamentary constituencies since 2020. That's exactly what we need to do. We need to take the SDGs down to the provinces, to the states, to the villages, you know, and help people to understand and involve themselves in the work we're doing on the SDGs. At the same time, working with it at a standard globally. You know what I mean? Local, global, and how we integrate the two. We need to focus on data. Oops, it jumped. We need to focus on data. Data is extremely important because that is something that we are very weak in terms of ASEAN countries, etc. So localizing the SDGs, to me, is always a starting point. Because as you know, there's also this feeling, and that's quite common, where people say, oh, the SDGs, oh, that's something of the UN, right? I have nothing to do with the SDGs. You know what I mean? It's seen as something external. It's seen as something of the UN. There's no national ownership. There's no local ownership of the SDGs, and that this becomes a problem. You know? So there are opportunities like that we need to address. Challenges I outlined already. Some of the challenges that we have. And I think one way to go would be to look at what can we learn from other countries in ASEAN? Because in many areas, including no one left behind, some countries in ASEAN have done some pretty good work, and we can share that good practice. Okay? Because I know, for example, in online sexual exploitation, Thailand has set up some very good mechanisms with support of UNICEF here, how to deal with online sexual exploitation. And they're working directly with young people and mobilizing them to get them involved in designing some of the programs, advocacy, etc. That's a good practice. Yeah. Here in Malaysia. In Thailand, 5-6 years back, Thailand adopted the first adolescent health strategy to focus on adolescent health, and within that, a major part on mental health. That's a good practice. Thailand was the first country in the region at that time to have an adolescent health strategy focused specifically on adolescents, that age group, 10 to 19. Then Philippines picked it up, and I think Malaysia was also discussing. Other countries picked it up after that. You know? Why is that? Because you take your health policy, any health policy of governments, and I've looked at that, even Malaysia, you take your national health policy, you'll find a few paragraphs there focusing on adolescents and young people. That's it. Few paragraphs in your national health policy. That is not being a priority. You know what I mean? You need a standalone health policy to deal with adolescent pregnancy, deal with sexual reproductive health, etc., etc. So the problems and challenges that these young people face are ones that we need to deal with a separate policy on health. And I'm just talking about health for now, for the moment. Yeah. So, yeah. You just don't know that. My last slide. Yeah. Okay. I want to show you the slide. You can't see it, but when you get a copy, you'll see it. So the third point, and that's my third conclusion, is that we also have to not only localize the SDGs, we also have to inculturate the SDGs, what I call inculturate the SDGs. Meaning, what does the SDGs mean to me as an Indian, yeah, as speaking Tamil, as coming from a particular part of India, in my local context and local culture, in my tradition, in my family, in my community? You know what I mean? Bring it down to those, because those values are important for me to be able to link and see how SDGs can help me in terms of well-being. Local values, local practices, local knowledge, and local wisdom. These we get from our cultures, from our religions, from our traditions, etc. How far are we tapping this? How far are we talking to faith-based organizations, religious leaders about SDGs? You know what I mean? It's only the politicians and academics who are talking about it. We're not talking to faith leaders. We're not talking to, in Sabah, for example, Sabah, Sarawak, we're not talking to shamans. We're not talking to local village chiefs about what this means. That is what's important. And look at this slide. Indonesia did this excellent work in Bali. What they did, and this is a very good model that I propose to other countries to do, they developed what they call Tri Hita Karana. What is this? Tri Hita Karana is their worldview of the SDGs based on people, which is at the bottom, ecology, spirituality, yeah? 3 levels, which is part of their worldview. Then they took each of the SDG goals and categorized them under these 3 categories. So you have the largest number of SDGs that concern people, yeah, at the bottom. Then you have 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 SDGs that deal with climate and ecology. But remember, there are also 2 SDGs, especially 10 and 17, that have spiritual elements, as they called it. Yeah. So they've merged their religious cultural worldview with the goals of the SDGs. This is what I mean by inculturating the SDGs. Yeah. And this is work that we need to do as well. Good. Thank you very much.
just a summary of Dr. Victor's presentation on the SDGs in ASEAN. Okay, perhaps due to also my focus bias also, but here are some of the key points that I noted from the presentation. Number one was on especially the gaps, and perhaps looking at gaps more of opportunities as we move forward, was on policy, the opportunity for participation in the involvement of children and young people in national development, the socio-emotional development of children and young people, the technological threats that are there. Example is like deep fake apps and other applications that cause a mishandling of technology and a lack of data with regard to the resources that we have or the issues that we are mapping. Okay, so starting with a brief question, Doctor, how do we navigate through the increase in accessibility and the threat of unaccountable accessibility?
Yeah. This is one of the biggest challenges in dealing with online, yeah, and social networking, etc. So, for example, what the EU is now looking at, which I think is something we have to learn from, the EU is now discussing a draft convention which is mandatory for all the members of the EU to regulate and control artificial intelligence, yeah, in relation to human rights. Okay, so because they realize that AI and its technologies and so on are now being attracted to being misused for the purposes of online exploitation, exposing personal data, and so on and so forth. So this is a good example as to how even in terms of latest technology, AI and so on, that the EU is trying to regulate. And I think we will be very soon looking at that in ASEAN as well. Yeah. The second part of the question, the answer would be that there's always a gray line. And it's a gray area that we need to focus on. Because on the one hand, given the internet and globalization, it is unstoppable in terms of the access you can have to information. Yeah. That is, you cannot control that. Yeah. The access. At the same time, you realize that you can't use all that information, yeah, and all that information is not really the most useful, and that information can also be misused for purpose of violation of human rights, like hate speech, like pornography, to exploit children, etc. So how you navigate, while you have a right to access information and to share information and so on, you do have a human right on that, how you set up regulatory mechanisms to be able to control that exchange. And the biggest challenge that governments face is not so much internally with the government departments and ministries, etc. The biggest challenge they face is being able to establish regulatory mechanisms for private corporate sector. That's where we need to focus attention on. How can we bring corporate private sector down to regulatory mechanisms, monitoring systems that are established by government? Because governments have no control on private corporate sector. And we're letting it too loose. So now we have the Business for Human Rights, which is a UN also instrument that we're using to work with corporate sector to see how they can safeguard and protect human rights.
I would like to pass the floor now to Dr. Dennison for special intervention. Dr. over to you.
Thank you, Victor, for sharing with us. I've known Victor for a number of years when he was here, and when he returned to Thailand, he kept writing about human rights causes and wanting me to be involved with him. So this time when we were in Bangalore, end of December, I think Victor noticed that we were in Bangalore and he was in Bangalore. And we got a very good New Year lunch from his sister, where we were invited over to their home in Bangalore. But I think the theme that Victor has highlighted, to me at least, brings 5 key points that might have implications for our work. I know Dr. Su is here as well. So there's one point that we might want to look at. Now, I think firstly, it is important for us on mapping, let's say, Baling, Kuala Selangor, or Greek, or Shah Alam. We are very micro in our outlook and finding the issues and mapping them. But I think getting a regional focus is always helpful, because then we can benchmark with other countries in ASEAN and Asia. Of course, if you take the 193 countries, it seems very large and very distant when we compare Europe with us, or Japan or Korea, but more with our immediate neighbors of Indonesia, Thailand, Philippines, Singapore, might then give us some kind of benchmark to where we are or be progressing and so forth. So I think it's important. I know Dr. Wan and Dana were in Bangkok at UNESCAP. So I saw all their photos with all the high-powered people in Bangkok at the UNESCAP. So I think that widens. Dr. Su and Ken were in Nepal at the World Social Forum. That's not as high-powered, but very dynamic of people power. And others of us were at Loyola College in Chennai. So broadening our perspective, comparing notes and so forth is important. Second, I think, so Victor brought that dimension to tell us what's happening in Thailand or Indonesia, because we think we are doing great. We are the best in the neighborhood. And then it is, then the reality comes in. Actually, we are doing quite badly. We think we are, like it's a Malay phrase, my wife keeps reminding me, it's like Bodo Sombong. We think we are the pandai, but actually we are not. So that reality strikes when you go on a regional basis. But secondly, more importantly, is the Convention on the Rights of Children. I think we have not taken this as seriously as we should have. And I think Victor unpacking the CRC for us, from whether it is the protective dimension or from a rights perspective, is important. That it provides a legislation and an obligation of the state to fulfill it because of its international commitments. So it is not an option, because Malaysia signed. So it might have not signed the optional protocol, or it might have reservations, but there is enough in the CRC for us to hold the government accountable and the agency responsible far more accountable. So I think our parliamentary notes to the members of parliament need to take this quite seriously, from our data of analysis. If there is neglect, if there is a need for protection, then we have to highlight it, because we are the researchers in the background. They are the ones who have access to parliament. So instead of fighting with the speaker, should I be banned for 4 days or 3 days, I think they took like half a day to discuss that. Maybe they should discuss CRC. And that might be more fruitful in politics. So sometimes politicians give distractions to take from the core substantive issue. So I think our role as researchers is to keep the politician intact. And yesterday, when Dr. Su and Ken me, Victor, and Lydia at the Parliament, briefing them on poverty and welfare, I could see that some of our MPs said, you give me the points. Saya boleh buat ucapan. You berilah pandangan itu. So we now need to use them as the voice. So they are the SDG champions. They are the politicians of the day. And we then become the pembantu to them to facilitate. And if it's quoted, if it comes up, it's something significant. And I think in the CRC, as Victor pointed out, irrespective of whether the person is a citizen or not, so all the refugee children, the stateless children, the Rohingya children that come on the Orang Asli kids that we see not in school, not having fresh water, not having sanitation, is something of a major concern from rights and greater awareness of that. That leads to the third point, very briefly, the human rights approach to development. We have spoken a lot. Dr. Lid led a workshop on it. We need to affirm that in our writing, that it's a heart, it's a right. It is not just a gift that the government is giving, but it's the right of the citizen, and the government is responsible to deliver it. Now, fourthly, I stand corrected, I don't think we have had a focus group discussion where children were the only participants. I know we have had youth, we have had indigenous people, we had fishermen. Where? Sungai Petani, where children. So maybe in all our lawatan from now on, make sure we have one children from the kampong or the flats and ask them about what is their experience. Maybe get them to play the games Zoel teaches about linking SDG. Maybe they might tell you about child abuse. They might tell you about sexual things. They might not talk it, but if you do an activity, that might come out. Because they do say if children paint everything in black or they do some kind of one, you can bring it out. So maybe we should have something of children as well. And what are children saying of development or their aspirations for the future in part of it? And I think that is something we can do in the focus group discussion. And maybe Joel's team might now need to add children and youth rather than just youth. That means go to primary school, children below 18 as a focal point. Maybe they might be far more enthusiastic on SDGs than the adults are, because they might be able to relate to children in other poverty situations. They might be able to relate to the mangrove swamp, like Budiman in Parit Bunta brings children to the swamp to plant mangrove as an activity and to teach them why mangrove swamp is important. So these kind, I know we have youth camp or children's camp, youth camp. So maybe we need to lower the age now to include children or get children from primary school to look at SDGs as well. So Victor, thank you for stimulating our thinking. Now, whether Victor likes it or not, once you come into the APPGM secretary contact, there is no escape route. They say no free lunch, so no escape route, because Victor has agreed to help us in the organizing of the ASEAN level SDG conference. In fact, this morning breakfast talk with him, I told him I'll pick you up early, using my wife as the pretext, but we had more than 1 hour of discussion, and he gave the outline for the 2-day conference. And then we need to identify speakers for 2025, when Malaysia is chair of the ASEAN, we are bringing ASEAN parliamentarians and ASEAN research teams across the 10 ASEAN countries together. So maybe our researchers need to start comparing with, I know Darshini is going to Vietnam, Dr. Wan went to Thailand. So now follow up with some field visit, see some of the projects so that we think beyond Malaysia, we think beyond our kampong, then we begin to see what it is. When I was in Chennai, I think the most tragic story I heard was a group of women came to the YWCA. They all said the meeting will start at 9 o'clock. The opening of the conference, they said we must be seated by 2 o'clock. It started at 3:30 and the minister came at 4 o'clock. So you are exhausted before the event starts. So I thought 9 o'clock, nobody will come. The group came by 8:30. And these were manual scavenger wives of men who died in septic tanks. So as they were talking, I was wondering, how in the world is septic tanks in Malaysia cleaned? Because I didn't have a clue, because we don't have anyone going down and so forth. But here are people who died. And then what they tell us is, for life, they are branded as dirty people. Even if they become a graduate, even if they work on, they are said they cannot enter somebody's house because you come from a family that is downcast. That means your role is only at that place. So it's really sad to see that situation. And later, we went to visit a group of Dalit young boys whom James' organization then funded a project. And James was pleasantly surprised that many of these Dalit boys actually have gone on to university and very enthusiastic group. So let's try our best to look at a neighboring country, if you get a chance to go for a conference, to learn about some of these issues as well, so that we open our thinking beyond Malaysia, beyond our own kampong. And let us give a hand to Victor for inspiring us. This is not his first and last visit to us. We might have many Zoom meetings. He's not very far away. Actually, Thailand is quite close. I'm told Thailand is cheaper to fly than to go to Kuching. So, because Goa give me an unbelievable ticket price to Kuching. So thank you very much, and back to Phyllis.